So before starting getting the responses from our distinguished panelists, let me briefly introduce you to B20 for those who doesn't know it enough. The Business 20 is an official engagement group of the G20. It started in the Korean presidency 5 years ago, and it is a platform, a global platform for the business world to have a policy dialogue with the G20 leaders and the G20 officers. So each year the host country organizes the Business 20. There is no permanent secretariat. This year it was Turkey, which is holding the G20. We also organized the B20. And in the case of Turkey, the Union of Chambers of Turkey has been designated as the host organization. The B20 works in task forces. We had 6 task forces this year: infrastructure, employment, trade, anti-corruption, financing growth, and finally a new task force that was initiated by Turkey, SMEs and entrepreneurship. This was our flagship task force this year, and it was brand new. These task forces meet a few times during the year. They have representatives from companies from all G20 nations. This year we tried to increase the representation to the emerging G20 nations, as it was dominated very much by the European and American businesses. And we had 2 in-person meetings, joint task force meetings, one in April here in Washington, D.C., in the World Bank IMF annual meetings, at the margins of those meetings, and we had an interaction with the G20 finance ministers who are meeting there. And the second one in Paris during the OECD week. Again, we created interaction with the ministers and officers who are coming to the OECD week and strengthened the policy dialogue. The task forces finished their work. They finished their reports, policy reports. They are all available on the B20 website, which I encourage you to check. And we also authored a report which synthesizes these policy recommendations and advises to the G20 finance ministers our top 19 priority recommendations in all the areas that I mentioned that the task forces worked on. This year, B20 also had a unique strategy to engage the emerging market businesses more to the process. Because they lack awareness and also they lack resources, the emerging market companies are not well represented in the task forces. So what we did was to go to the emerging market countries and get their opinions through the events in those countries. So we had regional consultation meetings in Saudi Arabia, in India, in Singapore, in Russia, in Brazil, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, also in non-G20 countries, and also at critical business events like the World Economic Forum, like the World Chamber Congress, to enlarge the audience and enlarge the contributions to the B20. And we integrated these views to the task force reports and the policy recommendations. So it was a very long but fruitful process. This week we'll have 2 more events in Istanbul, B20 Energy Forum and B20 Digital Economy Forum. They are again next to the relevant ministerial meetings, so we'll also interact with the G20 energy ministers and trade ministers. Especially this B20 Digital Economy Forum is being organized for the first time, so we are pushing the digital economy agenda into the B20, and we are looking forward to the Chinese presidency, which is taking over next year, to continue this agenda. And then we'll have our final event in Antalya, where the CEOs will meet the G20 leaders and discuss the recommendations. So with this brief introduction, I'd like to turn to the panelists and start with Gary Litman. I'm trying to be a bit provocative, and let's see how your response will be to this question. You are no stranger to Turkey. You have been involved in the European affairs as the Vice President of the US Chambers for quite a long time, and you are no stranger to the Turkish commercial diplomacy. How did we do? How did we perform in terms of our, G20 presidency and the B20 presidency? And did we get any benefits from this process?
Thank you, Ussal. I know we're in Washington, but I'm still your guest here, so I'll be very polite. I'm not going to grade you in any way, but I do want to share our assessment of this year, although I understand it's not over and you still have a lot more to do, including the summit in November. We look at the process on 2 tracks: the government-to-government conversation, G20, and the private sector to government conversation, B20. In terms of the G20 process, our expectations were modest but important. We were hoping that after the outbreak of the global financial crisis in 2008, G20, as the committed to rescue global economy, would take a pause, would give a breather to the financial sector, to the capital markets, and let the various new policies, rules, regulations, laws be absorbed by the market without rocking the boat. The first 5 years of G20 in its current format produced an enormous amount of new constraints on the financial markets, most of them fully justified, but as they get implemented, the users of financial services, the corporate treasurers, were beginning to see some unintended and some intended consequences which were constraining business activity. So going into this year, we were asking our government and other governments to assess the various new innovations in terms of bank supervision and insurance supervision and exchange supervision, and see if they're still helping economic growth or beginning to go too far. That was one expectation, and I think we were heard. This year, various instruments of G20 did not introduce any new highly restrictive regulations on financial services, financial products, or financial actors, while at the same time monitoring implementation in all the member states very carefully. The second thing that we wanted to see from G20, the government process, is a signal to the market where the future risks might be, or whether it's time to prepare for economic recovery. We did not get that. For a variety of reasons, the officials were still spooked by the markets, did not see the entrepreneurial activity picking up. We can analyze that, but what we were hoping to hear so far has not happened. We get a lot of expressions of concern, unease, they're using different terms, but there was no positive, encouraging signal to the markets from G20, and again, we can debate how justified that is. Now, in terms of the B20, Ussal, that's something that TOBB and everybody else have been engaged in. Our main expectation was that, as you said, the Turkish private sector would seize this once-in-a-generation opportunity to expand its own global perspective. Be everywhere, talk to everyone, invite everyone, and I think you've done a fantastic job. I understand how difficult it was. Even in Washington, you've hosted a number of meetings that we couldn't match. The U.S. Chamber was jealous of what you put up here. So I think you spend the year reminding the world that the Turkish entrepreneurial class is robust, vigorous, independent, aggressive, that you go to places where many established companies cannot go or see too much risk to go, that you make business happen. We've seen some new faces. We were very interested in how you, Turkish business community, interact with your own government and other governments. It was open, it was professional. I wouldn't be a chamber official without expressing some disappointments and frustrations. We always do, that's our job. I think there was a lot of backward looking, like this is what we used to do, this is how we thought we would be doing business. A lot of looking back and not enough looking forward. Where will Turkish business go? How will you structure your relationship with other businesses around the world? Where do you see the next 5 years in terms of risk or opportunity? I think we didn't get enough of that in B20 conversations. But you did a fantastic job giving the task that you were dealing with, and the year is not over.
Thank you. Also, thank you for your positive views about B20 Turkey. Devan, let me come to you and ask this question. I think Gary's comments were more positive about B20, but not that positive about the G20. And it's G20 is evolving. It started as a finance ministerial, then it became at the leaders level 7 years ago, and then B20 started 5 years ago. So it's an evolving process, and the global governance system is evolving. So how do you see the G20, B20 role in this system, and are they performing well? Did we improve this performance this year? And what are the expectations from upcoming years?
First of all, good morning to everyone. It's terrific to be here and to participate in these discussions. Just a little bit of the history, right? I mean, the G20, although it has existed for 17 years, it really became front of center ever since the crisis, right? 2008 and onward. So the crisis was certainly the element that brought the G20 to the foreground, and people began taking notice. Now, in a nutshell, yes, I think it is incredibly relevant. And there's very specific motivating reasons for me to say that. One, the obvious one, is that the 20 economies represent about 75 to 80% of the global GDP. So if there's any change that's going to be made in a significant way, it's got to come from the so-called leadership over the global economy. So it is relevant in terms of its scale, its size, and its ability to make potential changes. But I think there are a few other aspects that make them relevant and probably would make them even more relevant as we go forward. Right. One is it goes without saying actually that the global economy has itself transformed. Right. We now are in a multipolar economy. It's no longer a situation where the G2 or the G3 or the G5, G7 are sufficient, right, to drive policy. And it's related to the ability to coordinate policy, right? It's not a question of a single country coming up with a certain policy strategy. It's an element as to whether or not you can get some of these major economies, right, to play the game together, right? That is the critical part, because when policy is not coordinated, that's when you get arbitrage opportunities, right, and distortions take place. So the fact that we are in a multipolar world, right, requires, a forum that is manageable, right? I mean, you certainly can't have the G200. I mean, forget it. You're not going to get too many things discussed at that time when we have it in the UN, right? So, but where you need policy to be actionable, it needs to come down to a sizable level. So that's one. The other thing which I think beefs up its relevancy is that, and we saw this during the crisis, and I recall this because I was a senior leader at the World Bank at that time, and we were thrust right into the financial crisis. The G20 helped provide credibility, right? That there was some action that was being taken, whether this resulted in actual change or not, and I happen to believe that it has, although it can go a lot more. It was that credibility factor, that confidence building factor was a critical element. A third element that I would mention is that the G20 brought inclusion, right? It was, and this was related somewhat to the first point that I made, right? And that is that it is not just the rich, right? You've got the BRICS in there. You've got Mexico in there. You've got a number of these emerging market players, Turkey, Indonesia, etc. And that element of inclusion brought the debate about issues that went beyond the G20, right? It did bring issues on, you know, how do we go forward on the digital divide, although I know that you weren't too happy that, you know, we hadn't done more on that, and I agree as well. How do we include the 2 billion people who are not included financially? That went beyond the G20, right? So that element of inclusion has also come in place quite well. I just want to stop by saying this, right? One is, so the relevance question, yes, absolutely critical. What is the purpose of the B20 being in the G20, right? Why the B20? The role of the B20, the business community there, is not to trumpet, you know, what achievements of the business is, nor is it to market, you know, your country and so on for investments. I know that it does take place, but the predominant reason is that the G20 wants input from the business that would influence their knowledge and the quality of the policies that they can make, right? That is what government does, right? They make policy. They wanted inputs from the business community so that they can make those policies legitimately, so that there are no, you know, loopholes that are provided and so on. And I think that is a tremendous opportunity for the business community, right? And which I saw firsthand in Turkey, where leaders of business were bringing up issues, not about their industries alone, but about the global economy, about infrastructure in general, that in totality would improve the business environments throughout the G20 as well as beyond. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. I think you put forward the 3 distinguishing features of G20: actionability, credibility, and inclusion. Building on this, I want to ask a question to Lina. Given these features of the G20 and what we have done in B20, and you are the only panelist who was involved in the task force process, so you know it very well, how the task forces work and the, you know, the recommendations that were produced. 2 questions. One is, why is your company involved in the B20 as a large American company? And secondly, did you get what you wanted? Are you happy with the recommendations? What are the, you know, most critical recommendations in your point of view that are produced this year?
Thank you very much, Ussal, and let me just add as well that it's a delight to be here this morning. So why did Fluor get involved in the B20, and what did we hope to get out of the process, and what was our sense of it and so forth? Fluor is a big, giant global engineering and construction company, about $25 billion in annual revenue. We do mega projects of all kinds all over the world, from infrastructure to oil and gas and a range of other things. And obviously, the whole notion of growth in the global economy is very critical to the idea of growth of our company. And so we certainly want to do and engage and want to do all that we can to be participants in serious and pragmatic discussions that are all designed to, in some manner, shape, or form, to have an impact on policies designed to orchestrate and generate higher levels of growth. Now, I think that our experience with the process, and we've been involved in this, by the way, going back to the French presidency. I personally was engaged very much in the work under the French presidency. Our CEO led efforts of a task force under the Mexican presidency. We were very much involved under the Russian presidency. We were very much engaged in Australia and certainly now in Turkey. And I would say that in a very important way, and perhaps it's been alluded to, that we view the whole B20 process as a consensus building process, if you will, around important policy matters. And you think about this, we had 90 companies, over 90 companies involved in our task force work this year. The other task forces had numbers on that size, or perhaps even a bit larger. So when you have that many companies involved in 5 or 6 task forces, and these companies represent all geographies of the world and all shapes and sizes of large companies, SMEs, and so on, it is always interesting how, when you get down to talking about very specific policy proposals, how a consensus really does develop, whether it's around anti-corruption, infrastructure, financing, growth, job creation, etc. So we believe that that this whole process is very dynamic and very important. And we, of course, as has been pointed out, the idea here is to provide our point of view in a strong advisory role to the G20 leaders, with the hopes that this will somehow result in a consensus among them to move forward and actually implement these policy proposals. This year, I can share with you that our final report indicates that there are 19 very specific policy proposals. And some of these, I should add, are not necessarily brand new to this year's B20 process. The one thing that Turkey have done many great things, but I think you saw one thing that I really applaud this year is the fact that you focused on continuity from past B20 processes, and there was a slant toward implementation. And I think those two characteristics were vitally important to this year's success. So that what the G20 representatives are going to be hearing when we meet in November is here's a list of 19 proposals. Some of them are already in process of implementation. Some of them need some further, shall we say, work to continue to advance their implementation. But these are all proposals that will, in fact, in the judgment of global business, make a difference in moving the global economy forward. So at any rate, Ussal, I'll stop here and just say the floor very much values this process, and we very much value having been involved in your process this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. So I want to go into some more specific task force discussions now and turn to Jeff. Jeff is the founder and director of the B20 advisory group of the ICC, and ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, is very much involved in, they are involved in all the task force discussions, but specifically on trade. And their chairman was also the chair of the trade task force. So what we see in the trade area, and you know, particularly with regards to Turkey, Turkey is not included in the TTIP negotiations. We don't see a Turkey-America free trade agreement in the near future. And multilateral process is not going very well. The only achievement of the WTO was maybe the trade facilitation agreement, which we also discussed in our task force, but it is ratified by a handful of countries. And you know, we are very far away from the total number that we need for the implementation. And B20 this year actually didn't put forward a recommendation on the multilateralism, which Turkey supports big time. So is multilateral trade negotiations, is it dying? And what is B20's take on that, and what will be the discussions focused in the upcoming years?
Thank you, Ussal. You know, that's a great question, and I think we're going to transition to some of the details. But before I answer that question, really I'd like to jump in on a couple of the questions that you asked some of the other panelists. In particular, the question to Devan, about the relevance of the G20. The ICC certainly believes that the G20 is and will continue to be, a critical body for global governance. And, I think what we've seen over the last, certainly the last 10 years, but maybe even a little bit longer, is that, international policy making is increasingly evolving from the vertical, national-driven policy agendas that we've seen in the past and evolving toward more of a horizontal approach toward policy making. And that's why these global governance bodies like the G20, like APEC, ASEAN, even the BRICS are going to be increasingly important, as the world connects, becomes more interconnected, more dependent economically and politically. And so, when we look at these last few years of the G20, there's certainly a number of successes that Gary pointed to, some things that they were instrumental in right after the financial crisis. But I think this is really just the beginning of the G20 watch. I think, 5 years from now, we'll look back at the Turkish cycle and say, my goodness, that was really just early days still, even though, there's a lot of discussion about whether the G20 has lost its momentum and does it still have a core agenda, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the wrong discussion. I think the discussion is going to be more forward-looking. And the value is that the G20 or these governance bodies allows governments to set a policy agenda and I think maybe more importantly build habits of cooperation among diverse groups of countries that really haven't had a lot of experience, in tackling issues, sometimes down at the grassroots level of some of the, some of the issues on the G20 agenda. And, if I transition over to the B20 a little bit with those words, Lee mentioned that one of the benefits of the B20 has been consensus building amongst this diverse set of companies that operate across sectors and across borders. It's consensus building, but by the same token, it's also we're building habits of cooperation amongst ourselves where we really haven't, on a cross-sector basis, tackled cross-border issues. The ICC does to a certain extent, certainly. But I think that's one of the things that we're taking out of the B20 process is, how we can work together, how we can come together on a certain set of key recommendations. This year, Lee mentioned it was 19. But if you rewind that tape all the way to Seoul, I think Gary mentioned Seoul, and Gary, for that matter, has been around the B20 process for as long as I certainly can remember. He was involved even back in Toronto. When the B20 first got started. And that what we've emerged with, ultimately I'm going to get to the question on the policy. Okay. I promise. But what we've come away with is we've had these B20 recommendations for 5 years, 6 years running now. And if you take a look at the collective body of knowledge that's been put together, then the recommendations in total number over 500. Now we've taken efforts to start whittling them down and focusing them, and over the last 2 years we've been concentrating on what are those core group, last year of 20, this year of 19, that can be taken from this process. But if you look back at that compendium of information, that is probably the single greatest body of business policy recommendation work that exists. And in talking to your colleagues in China who will lead the B20 process next year, that's exactly what we did, is we pulled together all of that work over the last 5 years, tried to organize it and sent it to them to say, look, here's what's happened in the B20, and it's an amazing amount of work, and let's continue to focus it on issues like trade and investment. So,
trade.
You want me to talk about trade?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
There's no question that the multilateral trade agenda is alive and will continue to be alive at least as long as Roberto Azevedo sits in the chair at the WTO. And, we certainly, we all know how difficult the Doha process has been. It's exhausting. It's demoralizing to a certain extent. But, there's a silver lining. We saw there has been progress on the trade facilitation agenda that goes all the way back to the Bali conference, and which I think is tied closely to the work that the B20 did during the Russian cycle, where we pounded on the table over and over again that the WTO, if it was going to have any chance to survive, had to start at square one, which was TFA, and our CEOs echoed that in letters to trade ministers and showing up to Bali. And lo and behold, 3 months after the St. Petersburg summit, they did show up in Bali, and they did agree in principle to move this forward. And we have seen an agreement, and we're in the process of getting ratification. And I don't think that you can hold the success of the TFA, Trade Facilitation Agreement, I don't think you can hold the success of that hostage to the national ratification process. Because there are, how many countries need to sign it now?
120, I think.
120. Every country has a different political time cycle. Every country has a lot of political issues. It just takes a while, and I don't think it's fair, at least right now, to say that TFA or WTO or multilateral will be dead because of the slowness in the ratification. Another bright spot is the progress that they made on services this year. So I think that to even question whether the WTO is and multilateralism is not going to exist would be short-sighted. What we should be looking at is how much progress has been made and the new momentum that's been generated in the last 12 months, as opposed to, and where that's going to take us. But I mean, Azevedo himself recently said, to the press, that the WTO and the multilateral system is alive and well. It will work.
Thank you. So trade agenda has been here for years, but this year we added this SME agenda, and we started a new task force, as I said, on SMEs and entrepreneurship. And a direct product of this task force was the World SME Forum, which is an international organization established by the Union of Chambers and the International Chamber of Commerce. Devan is involved in that process, both the task force and the World SME Forum. And there, maybe you can talk more about the World SME Forum. What are the business plans? What are the targets? And what has been done so far?
Sure. By the way, Jeff is also very well acquainted with the WSF, so please jump in. And some of you may have heard what this WSF, so-called WSF is, but let me give you a little bit more about it. It's the World SME Forum, a new organization that has been created which is going to be 100% private sector led, but with strong government endorsement by way of the G20. So why do we need, such a new international organization? And for that, you can't ignore the history of what's gone on. I mean, ever since the Bretton Woods organization, we are putting a start point to history, just towards the end of the war. Ever since Bretton Woods, there's been a lot done, to intervene in the global economy, to help SMEs and so on. But the results have been mixed at best. There have been some successes, mostly created by country environments. I can name the Singapores of the world and so on, who've done a pretty reasonable jobs. The U.S. as well on SME development. But by and large, in the rest of the world, SMEs have stymied, right? And they've not really broken the ceiling to register huge growth. Now, part of the reason for this is that while a number of organizations internationally and locally, nationally, have ownership, right, of some form of guiding and enabling SMEs to grow, there's not been one single international organization that has complete ownership over this process, right? And so, yes, as I indicated, I was in the World Bank. The World Bank is actively involved in helping SMEs throughout the world. The IFC is, the regional development banks are, but no ownership, right? Now, when you say no, when there's no ownership, that means no one represents SMEs at important fora, right? Especially in standard-setting bodies, in, for example, the FSB, or so. There's no representation, right, at all. So when you're not seated at the table, you can't really be pushing, right, the agenda for SMEs. So we saw, a few of us saw a crying need, right, that we need to raise the game, right, on SMEs and not just talk about it, right? We all know what the problems are. They are numerous. So we used the B20 agenda, right? The Turkish government was highly supportive of this. I remember the early days discussion with Babacan, the former deputy prime minister of Turkey, who was leading the G20, and he thought that this is something that that Turkey really needs to push. And so the early discussions began taking place. The International Chamber of Commerce was intimately involved, together with the Turkish chambers as well, to spearhead this initiative. Now, I believe in April, was it April, that it was formally launched in Washington and endorsed by the G20 finance ministers, right, where there was agreement that there's a need for this, let's push for it. So what does the World SME Forum aim to accomplish? Three things, right? It'll be organized along three pillars. One is to act as the advocacy, right, leader for SMEs, right? In other words, to make sure that we are represented, right? That SMEs globally are represented in international discussions and standard-setting organizations. So that's one, and I'm distilling it very quickly. Second is that we saw a need for scalable, especially given the today's digital technology, for scalable interventions to advise SMEs through national and local organizations, right? And in fact, leveraging from the experiences, the successful experiences of some countries, adapting them and bringing them to others. That's a second part. And the third pillar is, how do we bring information and knowledge to SMEs in a more transparent way, right? And so there's a platform that's going to be focused on developing a digital agenda. We know that there are several opportunities, as the business community themselves told us, right, in the space of getting SMEs more involved in your global value chains, right? Each one of your companies have got these global value chains, and very frequently SMEs are excluded from it purely because no one knows about their capacities, capabilities, or their lack of as well. So I see that the WSF is still in its early days right now. We've got a governance structure. The CEO has been appointed, Tunç Uyanık, who is was a long-term professional of the World Bank. He's leading the organization. There are already 4 or 5 concept notes being developed in response to what the B20's Taskforce on SMEs told us, right? They said, look, go explore the possibility of providing some sort of guidance on credit rating systems, all right? That's one. Two is there a way to accelerate the process of certification, right, so that SMEs can be incorporated into the GVCs, right, in the global value chain. Three is let's address the issue that was brought up earlier about the unintended consequences in the financial markets that affect SMEs, right? And let's make sure to get these arguments ready for the China round, right, next year, and push on this agenda, and so on and so forth. So there are ideas that are already beginning to take shape, and I hope that we can get you guys interested, right, in the SMEs, and we would want to hear, right, from the private sector directly with regards to what are some of the critical issues that the WSF should be focused on. Jeff, you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. First, let me just say that, this is a fantastic legacy for the Turkish government, really. It's been part of your whole approach with the 3 I's and inclusiveness, and there's no way that we can rebuild or, build a sustainable future global economy if it doesn't have, the input from the SMEs and their potential for growth. But just 2 comments to follow up what you said. There's this saying that's probably somewhat overused: act globally, or act locally, think globally, right? And I think, though, that it applies here. Because, supporting SMEs is primarily about acting locally. These are small companies that, for the most part, act locally, but are increasingly trading and selling or part of global value chains. And you have organizations like the Chicago Chamber of Commerce, for example. If you go to their website, it's rich and filled with information on how to support, small companies from that region. Same thing with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Many of the chambers of commerce, TOB itself, offers a lot of support and information and services and tools to help SMEs. And that's the act locally, but there isn't, like Devan said, really a voice for thinking globally for the SMEs. And that's been the missing piece, a global service to the SMEs, and that's what the World SME Forum is really one of the things that it's bringing to the table. ICC has been trying to do that to a certain extent. It's not just ICC, it's our World Chambers Federation, which includes partners from TOB and U.S. Chamber sitting right here at this table. But there's a lot more that we can do in terms of thinking globally. And the other point that I wanted to make is that, going back really to your first question, the real value of the G20 is, setting an agenda and driving the implementation of that agenda through primarily implementing agencies. If you wanted to refer, we're talking about the WTO, if you want to refer to the WTO as an implementing agency, the G20, if it can set an agenda, it still needs a body to implement and to drive things. And, to this point, there doesn't really exist such an agency for all the things that need to be done on SMEs, and the World SME Forum fills that void.
Thank you. Gary, I'll now come to you and ask, how does the American business world see the SME agenda? And in general, how are the American companies engaged with the B20? And whether, since this year we have seen a lot of Turkish engagement to B20 naturally, and we are hoping it to stay. So can we use this platform for interaction of Turkish and American businesses in the upcoming cycles?
Well, as Jeff has mentioned, we've been involved in G20 from get-go, and that was primarily a response to the crisis in the capital markets and the financial system. So by definition, it impacted the larger multinational financial firms. They concentrated the risks, they didn't know what to do with that, and they offloaded the risk on public budgets. So it's when G20 started looking for ways out of the crisis and looking for engines of growth that would not be tied closely to public spending, which is constrained even today in most countries, the issue of SMEs came front and center in the United States and many other countries. We were looking at small and medium-sized enterprises as the solution to the lack of demand, the lack of optimism, if you will, while the Wall Street and the City of London and other financial sectors were restructuring themselves, laying people off, changing the rules, changing the price of money, and the governments were saddled with enormous public debt and very constrained in terms of the stimulus they could provide, with the exception of Federal Reserve and ECB, who could control the currency. That's how we got into the discussion, at least at the Chamber, how we got into the discussion of SMEs, not for the sake of changing anything that's done in the United States. As you know, we represent 3 million companies in the US, so by definition, most of them are small. It doesn't mean that they want to remain small. There's no particular badge of honor in being a small company in the United States. You want to be big. Even if you start with 2 guys or 1 family, you want to go big and you want to be successful, and eventually you want to go global. So I think the approach in the US, thank God, is much more ambitious. Companies see themselves, smaller companies, they see themselves at the beginning of something huge. And they're not necessarily looking for government support or studying the ways of reaching to Small Business Administration or looking at the Chamber of Commerce. They take the risk themselves. And our view was, it is the return to the risk-taking culture in the financial sector that would be an answer, partially an answer, to the slow growth, so that the banks are more willing to provide credit, the credit cards, which are the main source of financing for American SMEs. It's the wife's credit card. That begins again generating growth, including some new ways of SME financing, Kickstarters and other ways enabled by the digital economy. So our approach to SME conversation was, and still is sort of somewhat different from many other countries, particularly in Europe. It's much more freewheeling, I must say, and focuses on a specific issue, money. How do you make money more available to the companies at the early stages of their growth? And that's partially a reflection of fairly open market that we have. Nationally, many of you know, the Chamber is constantly in the headlines demanding reduction of burdensome regulations and more opportunities for business and inclusion and procurement chains, etc. So that's part of the approach. In terms of the bilateral relations, for us, Turkish business community seems to be undergoing a major transformation. It's a generational change. It's the emergence of a whole new class of mid-sized companies that have carved a place in the Turkish market and now looking for partners and looking for opportunities where we also would like to find some opportunities. But we have the financing that the Turkish companies cannot get because money costs a lot more in Turkey. And we have the global experience that many of the new Turkish companies are beginning to get. And we welcome them to, come and compete on the U.S. market, take risks in other markets with U.S. financing behind you. We see a lot of risk-taking. What we can offer is some experience, cheaper money, more aggressive capital that, you know, takes stakes in Turkish enterprises. I guess what we need to get, and maybe SME Forum will be helpful there, for us it's always a question of due diligence and understanding who you're dealing with and how the corporate structure is organized and what's the longevity of a particular form of doing business. Because we want partnerships that will allow us to grow with you. It's knowing your partner. One of the results of the financial crisis, and I'll stop right there, is that there's been a withdrawal of international financial institutions from many emerging markets, which limits the flow of information. Credit assessment is more difficult. New companies come in. How do you gauge whether they're creditworthy? Which bank do you go to? Which credit agency do you go to? What's the scoring? Who else is taking the same risk? How is the regulator looking at the risk? I share Jeff's perception. We're at the beginning of a new stage in international business interaction. We just need to look forward. You know, we need to try and figure out what's the next growth opportunity, and not necessarily apply the established labels like, you know, this is SME, this is non-SME, this is multinational. That's not. Many multinationals are behaving like a bunch of SMEs in different markets, and many SMEs are truly global from get-go because they sell everywhere. We need to be very careful and make sure that we enable the new models of doing business, because that might be one of the values of conversations within the World SME Forum.
Thank you. We have only 15 minutes remaining, so I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Any questions? Wait over there. Can you take the microphone over there? Yes.
Strategic Straits, I consult small to mid-sized businesses in market entry, and I wanted to ask if a small to mid-sized business could benefit from any part of the initiative. I know it's in early stages, and what they should do. Imagine a company in Turkey, few $1 million, and they want to grow in the US market. Is there any resource that you can offer within this framework at this time?
Let me first ask this to Dev, whether World SME Forum would be relevant for this, and then maybe Gary, if the US Chambers is a relevant platform for this.
Well, I'll say this much. I think the World SME Forum will become very relevant to an entity such as that you described. Maybe not directly, right, but through the information that is put out, one. And what I can envisage is also that, I mean, the WSF intends to work, right, with the local establishments or national establishments, right, who oversee SMEs themselves, right, so that the help can come directly, right, locally for the SME of concern. So there are two ways that I can see that, right, that the role of the WSF, right, is to be working with the local SME associations in pushing for better competencies to help SMEs, right? That's one area that you could see the benefit coming from, and more directly through the digital platforms, right, that will be available to anyone, right, who wants to avail of that information at the global level. others may have some thoughts with regards to how existing help. I must say that if you go to the WSF site right now, you're not going to get any help, right? Because we're literally, putting the patches together at the moment.
Are there, Gary, is U.S. Chambers, is it a relevant platform for this?
Of course, we're a relevant platform, but it's a platform. So as you know, we have many interactions that we host between Turkish and American business people, government officials, but it's very business specific. I don't think there's a generic answer. If you have interest in the U.S., come to the U.S. Chamber, show up on November 1st. You'll have some business. But you will learn a lot. You'll understand the networks. And depending on the business you're in, you may find a tremendous opportunity or change your business plan. So by all means, come see our experts. We have an SME department that deals specifically with issues affecting American SME market participants. And obviously we have an international team that tries to understand market conditions overseas. In both cases, it's open for conversation, but it's very business specific.
Okay. Any other questions? Please.
Not so much a question. I was going to just comment on this. On the topic that was just raised. In Turkey, companies that are seeking to do business in the United States could avail themselves of the resources of the U.S. Commercial Service in Ankara or Istanbul. And I know of what they can do right away is put them in touch with the various economic development agencies that are in the individual states. Now, this is not just a theoretical point. A company in Turkey, more of a medium-sized company than a small company, it's just concluded all of the preliminary work to make an investment in a rural portion of South Carolina for a textile factory. Now, again, the state economic development agencies were in South Carolina, were very, involved in making, helping them, assisting them, obviously for, they wanted to bring investment into the state. But, it was, a lot of this was coordinated, I think, through the U.S. government services in Turkey. Initially, of course, the company had to come over and make the connections and be introduced to investors. But certainly for companies looking to do business in the U.S. From Turkey, there are already established U.S. government services that could put them in touch with the relevant state agencies that are very eager and actually eager to compete for that kind of business coming into their states.
Okay, Lee, I have a question for you. Let's talk about corruption a bit. Most of the companies here at this conference are anti-corruption. Most of the companies that are here are from industries like defense, healthcare, which are doing business with the government. So the government procurement systems are very important for them. And the anti-corruption task force worked on the procurement processes this year. It was one of the work streams. How do your recommendations relate to American companies that are doing business in emerging markets like Turkey?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, we've spent quite a bit of time focused. In fact, I would say this is certainly one of the primary issues that we have addressed both this year and last year under the Australian presidency. But I think we've made some excellent headway this year. Without question, the procurement process lends itself to all kinds of possibilities for mischief. And when you get into procurement such as for infrastructure type projects and things of that nature, you can imagine it gets extraordinarily complicated there. It's not only the bidding process, but it's the permitting processes, it's the actual execution of projects and so forth that present all kinds of opportunities. And I'm not going to do it, but I could sit here and probably reel off any number of, shall we say, situations that were most unfortunate in that they turned into examples of corruption that we probably have read about or know about. But I would say as a premise, we've said many times here in the panel today that the G20, B20 process is largely about facilitating more robust levels of growth. And those of us who have been working on the anti-corruption front of all of this would say that, that the corruption issue is a huge barrier to growth. So in the whole government procurement space, we have this year zeroed in on what we think are three very interesting proposals. And let me just tick them off for you. The first one is very simply this, that we believe that any company that seeks to secure a contract from a government agency should be able to demonstrate that its compliance program has an anti-corruption component to it. Now, we've kind of taken a little different tack with this and have suggested that perhaps government could ensure this, excuse me, by incentivizing companies to have such anti-corruption programs with a benefit if it does. For example, you know, I would say companies even with outstanding anti-corruption programs can sometimes find themselves in some difficulty. So in the penalty phase, if something were to happen, if that company had in place an anti-corruption plan as a part of its compliance programs, perhaps it might get some relief in the penalty phase that otherwise it might not have available to it. So that is an area that we think should be examined very, very thoughtfully and carefully. Second, we have come to a point of view that e-procurement systems can do a lot in terms of creating much higher levels of transparency and accountability, and also result in much faster procurement processes that obviously yield a great deal in the way of efficiency. But we do think that there's sort of a direct relationship between the use of e-procurement in that it sort of takes out opportunities for behind-the-scenes possibilities for corruption to occur. I would say thirdly, the OECD and the Basel Institute on Corporate Governance in Basel, Switzerland, have stumbled upon an interesting concept called high-level reporting mechanisms. And so you're a company, you're in the process of seeking a procurement in a government anywhere in the world, and you come across something that you believe is inappropriate in the way of being asked for a bribe or offered a bribe or what have you. And so how do you deal with that? Well, one of the ways that one could deal with it is that if a government were to establish some place in its bureaucracy where the company could take a complaint and report that something inappropriately is happening, it would be an opportunity to investigate that and deal with it. Interestingly, this concept is being tested right now in the country of Colombia with very interesting results. The OECD and the Basel Institute would say that in Colombia, it has just having that high-level reporting mechanism in place has acted as a deterrent to mischief occurring, if you will. We also, I can tell you that other countries in that region of the world, based upon Colombia's experience, are also giving strong consideration to testing these mechanisms in their countries. We think that has great potential. So I would say that some of these things we feel, if they were implemented, could have yield very positive results. I must say, I'd also would like to add to this that this whole notion of procurement and anti-corruption around procurement processes really started last year and has continued this year in a sort of linkage to work done on infrastructure development. And as interestingly, last year about the work of the B20 identified something like $67 trillion worth of infrastructure need in the world. And they also identified that from public sources over a period of time, roughly 50 trillion might be available to address the infrastructure needs. So there is a gap of 20-some trillion dollars. So the idea that has been generated is that you could seek those funds from private sources, in other words, private investment opportunities. Well, when the private sector contemplates investing in something, particularly like infrastructure, they're looking to have the risks mitigated as best as possible. And so we kind of see this whole agenda around that I just kind of ticked off here as being a risk mitigation strategy, if you will, to help offset the challenges that are often associated with government procurements, particularly large ones such as infrastructure. But at any rate, our belief would be that, that by moving forth with the agenda that we've ticked off here, that it would increase efficiency, it would certainly increase transparency, and improve the overall use of public funds. So at any rate, that's, hopefully that's helpful.
Gary?
Could I add to Lee's remarks? He mentioned that the conversation about procurement was started under the Australian chairmanship of G20. The Australian government, in addition to running the conversation, endowed the World Bank with resources to undertake a global benchmarking of national public procurement in 82 countries. The first results will be unveiled on October 19th at the US Chamber. We'll have a public event where each of the teams that have gone around the world and actually assessed how public procurement works, really works, not as it's written up in the laws, will be presented by the people who actually did the studies. So 82 countries this year. There'll be a detailed comparison of the practices, and eventually it will become an annual assessment and benchmarking of countries, including the United States, on how public procurement meets the reality of business. So if anyone's interested, let us know. It's an open event.
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, then let me finish with one last question. You're very eager.
Yes, I love entrepreneurship and innovation that comes with it, as well as jobs. What have you noticed in terms of the understanding of anti-corruption compliance among small to mid-sized businesses across the G20 countries? What diversity do you see in terms of practices, and what do you advise them?
We actually had a special work stream on that, so Lee, maybe you can.
Yeah, we actually, within our anti-corruption task force, we have a work stream that was co-chaired by a colleague of Jeff's from the ICC. It was done in collaboration with the G20 anti-corruption work group. Actually asked us to undertake this, this body of work, but we have just about completed the development of an MSE anti-corruption toolkit that specifies in very clear language exactly how an SME can begin to confront the issue of corruption, and very specific set of recommendations and best practices for dealing with the corruption issue. We are very close to having this project completed, and in fact, the week after next, we are meeting in Paris with the G20 anti-corruption working group to review with them the details of this toolkit, and it will be shortly thereafter that we'll begin to work out the process of distributing it to making it available, let me put it that way, to SMEs in all G20 countries and beyond the G20 countries for that matter. So we're trying to work out the details of the best way to actually get the toolkit into the hands of SMEs.
Thanks much, Lee. So thank you everyone for joining our session, listening to what B20 Turkey has done and what are the prospects for the upcoming years and what was the contribution to Turkey's economic diplomacy. I would like to thank all the panelists and all the audience for joining us.